so y'all know. Okay, so welcome to our review session for the midterm 2020. I'm going to start with period 1, and with period 1, got a little heater here at my feet. I'm going to turn it off for a second. Okay. With period 1, I did mention in class today, the bolded items are what you need to focus on. So you're looking at the idea of why did the age of discovery happen? And you're looking at this age of discovery, 1491 to 1607. And this is period 1. This is with a focus on Spanish expansionism into the Americas and what would become ultimately the United States, but focusing on the Caribbean, North and Central America, and South America. So really this window of time is a focus on Spanish European mixing with Indigenous Americans and what that looked like. So the bolded terms are important. 4 kingdoms. Portugal begins exploration. They unify first, then Spain, Britain, the French and the Dutch as well are becoming powerful empires in this time. So the 5th one would be not a kingdom at all, but the Dutch Republic, which is quite different from any of the monarchies. Because of inventions, you see the capacity for exploration, and because the Crusades wiped out that realm of princes, you see consolidation of power at the top with monarchies. And so the 4 kingdoms and 1 republic are going to be able to afford expansion, exploration, colonization. And this is an advantage for them, but it comes at a cost for the people who live there. And that's certainly important if you're writing on this to look at those different perspectives and not just a Euro perspective, but also an American perspective. Because of the printing press, Christopher Columbus is able to publicize his journeys, his journals, his letters, and those become incentives for other Spanish explorations in this time, and ultimately other nations exploring as well. But really the 1491 through 1607, as far as the Americas go, belongs to Spain. So period 1 is really a focus on the Spanish interaction with the Americas. It's important for you to understand both the religious and the political ramifications of a Catholic Europe. So Christian Catholic Europe, both with the doctrine of discovery and the Treaty of Tordesillas, creating spheres of influence, the religious power of the Pope, designing the spheres of influence that is complemented by the political Treaty of Tordesillas. Those two complement each other and overlap each other and point out the importance of the Pope and that combination of church and state rule of the time that was the rule and not the exception. Ferdinand and Isabella, they are examples of consolidation of power in Spain that allows for this age of discovery to commence with Spain, and also shows a level of intolerance for groups not Christian. Okay, so you've got Europe is Catholic Christian, and the idea that Ferdinand and Isabella, after they unify Spain, there's a Reconquista and then an Inquisition. The Inquisition lasts for 400 years, and this is a very significant moment because if you are non-Christian, you have 3 options: banishment, conversion, or death. Those are your 3 options. So many fled the center of the Spanish Empire, which would be Seville, in that city of Seville of 60,000 people, and moved to the fringes of what would become the Spanish Empire, including one of the outermost fringes would be the San Luis Valley here in Colorado, with the Arkansas River as an international border with Spain. The idea of cultural superiority both indigenous sense of cultural superiority and Aztec cultural superiority, and internal vying for power between indigenous groups of people, Mayan, Aztec, Incan, that were scattered throughout, but intersected one another for expanding their own spheres of influence, with the Aztec being the most successful and sophisticated, with 200,000 people living in their capital city compared to Spain's 60,000 in their capital city. So certainly a sophisticated society with a sense of cultural superiority. With the Columbian Exchange, it was difficult for indigenous tribes to understand what was happening with the Columbian Exchange as far as the spread of smallpox. And so, with a gap in understanding of science and medicine and disease, often religion was an explanation for why one society might be doing better, the Christian society that came to the New World, and one society might be doing worse, the indigenous societies that were ill-equipped, their immune systems were ill-equipped for the European spread of disease that did decimate the populations of living in what would become the United States and throughout North America, Central America, and South America. As we move into the 1500s, and I do think that the Columbian Exchange may very well be the most important term on this paper, because it highlights the importance of the indigenous diet that gets transferred to Europe. It validates the civilization and sophistication of indigenous cultures, because corn, tomatoes, potatoes would find their way to Europe. And so this food supply that indigenous groups, tribes, civilizations had perfected the production of, that will be validated by Europeans who take these crops and want to spread them back home. So I think the Columbian Exchange is a validator for European society. It's a validator for indigenous society, and everyone wins as far as the food supply goes, as the life expectancy is enhanced. Not everyone wins from the biological portion of this exchange that focuses on disease. The Europeans had built up immunity over hundreds of years to smallpox. They too still suffered and died from it, but were not decimated by it as the indigenous Americans were. I want to talk a little bit about economics. The encomienda system and the mission system both reflect economics through capitalism, the encomienda system, and this sort of large swath of land where you enslave people to create your cash crops or your subsistence crops, but also cash crops. And the difference between those two: subsistence is a crop that you grow to feed your own family. Cash crop is a crop that you grow to sell, to be able to buy finished goods in the mercantile system that are produced typically in Europe, finished cloth, finished items that are maybe utilizing the raw materials in the colonies. So the encomienda system speaks to private land ownership, these land grants, and the lack of equity as indigenous Americans are enslaved for that capitalist end. Similarly, the mission system enslaves indigenous Americans for the strengthening of the religious mission system. To feed the missions, indigenous Americans are enslaved. and taxed. So talk about taxation without representation. Indigenous Americans are facing this in the mission system. Um, Martin Luther, I have him in bold just because this is going to begin to distinguish in the 1500s, Martin Luther's disagreement with Catholicism and that interpretation of Christianity will cascade into many, many protests over hundreds of years, both in Europe and here, with various revivals or reimaginings of religion. So the Protestant Reformation is really the first big one in Europe, where Martin Luther establishes Lutheranism and the idea of protesting against the Christianity that was Western Europe Catholicism. And from that, a cascade of other Calvinist, Baptist, Puritan, Methodist, Latter-day Saints, all cascading from that really original protest, not with the same interpretation, but with the idea of a different imagining of what Christianity could be over hundreds of years. So Martin Luther is significant because he is sort of the father of protest movements that could cost people their lives and did, but also reimagined what Christianity could, should, might be. So that's really powerful, that thought in religion is revolutionary, and that people have many different takes on, over 400 different takes on what Christianity could or should look like. So this is a powerful idea that Martin Luther brings to the front when he protests, and then all the protest movements that follow him. Bartolome de las Casas is going to be a counter to Juan Sepulveda. And Juan Sepulveda is not bolded on this paper, but I'm going to emphasize him a little bit. Might just want to make sure you know him. De las Casas said enslaving indigenous peoples was wrong, and that Americans should not be enslaved just because they're Americans. And he is going to be really the father of human rights, the idea that humans, wherever they are, whoever they are, have these rights. And then, of course, you'll be seeing that echoed with the Enlightenment and talking about the idea of natural rights and a social contract. But Bartolome de las Casas early on in 1550 is talking about this in regard to Native Americans. And Juan de Sepulveda is saying it's perfectly fine to enslave Native Americans, and we're not going to survive if we don't. So these are two Europeans, Spanish Europeans, with very different understandings of what the principled thing to do with the interactions with Americans, what that should look like. The Pueblo, so some of the indigenous, moving over to the second column, and I'm going to move a little faster because I want to make sure we have time for a lot of questions here. And when I finish period one, I'll open it up for questions if you have them. Indigenous Americans, I focus a lot on the Aztec, Moctezuma, also known as Montezuma, and the capital city of Tenochtitlan, the idea of a calendar, the sophistication of aqueducts, and just, again, the 200,000. If you can support that many people, that means you have a good drinking water supply and a sewage system that keeps people from getting sick, or at least allows a much smaller number to be sick. But in what would become the United States, this is important because looking at Pueblo in the southwest, Iroquois in the northeast, Anasazi also in the southwest, you see levels of sophistication. We have the Mississippi cultures as well, which I did not highlight, but you see varying levels of sophistication. Nothing to the extent that we've discovered of the Aztec. That really is the gold standard of sophistication in both Europe and in the Americas. But you do see, and if we do get to go to the Taos Pueblo in the spring, you will see a community that has been continuously inhabited for over 1200 years. So this is significant. The pueblos had has been established pre-Spanish interaction, and they had lived in these layers of housing, these apartments basically made of adobe for 1200 years now. And still today, it's a very small number that live full time in the Taos Pueblo, but there are family members who have continuously lived in there going all the way back for 1200 years. So while not as large as the Aztec, the communities in the Americas did have both hunter and gatherer and agricultural expertise that allowed them to um, sustain living in places like the Taos Pueblo and other pueblos throughout what today is mostly New Mexico, quite significant. So, and I have the year 700 on there. So for many of the Pueblo indigenous Americans. The Anasazi predate the Pueblo, and I basically that's just something I want to say, that it goes back even earlier. And so the Anasazi were located around the Mesa Verde area, and then for whatever reason they left, and there are many theories, and they change. But for whatever reason that the Anasazi left this area of Colorado, they migrate to what would become Mexico, and they are the ancestors of the Pueblo Indians. So again, systems based on largely corn, both in the Southwest with the Pueblo Anasazi, and also in the Northeast with the Iroquois, who have quite a democratic series of laws and governances within the Iroquois along the upper East Coast of the United States, which are some ideas that are modeled for us early on. Okay, the last 3, 4, 5, 6 things on here have to do with the shift in the balance of power. So at the beginning of this time period, you're focusing on Portugal kind of having been ascending. And so the world is divided into 2 spheres of influence between Portugal and Spain. And then by the end of this time period, you're seeing the rise of the British sphere of influence in the Americas. And so the next time period, period 2, will really focus on the British sphere of influence. But starting in 1587, you see the establishment of the first British colony. It's not the permanent one, but Roanoke is established in period 1 in this time period. And then we don't know what happened to it because of conflict between Spain and the British and the sinking of the Spanish Armada and the calls for those settlers in Roanoke to return to help support the British in their battle against the Spanish Armada, and ultimately defeating the Spanish Armada in 1588. So that's a really important year, the 1588, because it's really the rise of what would become the British zenith in their empire. So starting in the late 1500s. Powhatan is highlighted here as well, just because at the end of this time period in 1607, this is another indigenous American group that will help the early settlers make it, and probably regret that later on when they are displaced themselves. So Powhatan being both a confederacy of indigenous nations, also like unified together, a confederacy of groups that are all under the Powhatan umbrella, and also the name of the chief Powhatan, who is Pocahontas's father. And this is in the Jamestown region of the Chesapeake Bay, where they have their established civilization. Okay, so that is going to bring us to the end of period one. If you have a question on any of the things I've just talked about, just pop it into the chat or you can unmute. I'm happy to answer anything that you may be wondering about with period one. Does anybody have a question? Okay, I see some stuff coming in here to the chat. Yes, I will. As soon as this recording is done, it takes me a little while to process it, but I will put it on. And I think I have a couple of other recordings I'll put up too, but yes. Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay. So I have a couple of questions that I want to focus on here. And let me just talk for a second because they're two different questions, but they're linked. So in 14, and do I have dates on here? Let me just see if I do. Yeah, okay, I do. So in 1493, you have this doctrine of discovery, and this is the papal bull, which a papal bull is just like this seal. Sometimes it's in lead, sometimes it's in silver, but it's like this seal that's like almost like you would melt wax and then seal it, except the papal bull is usually in a metal, so it's like melted iron or melted silver to signify the certification of the document. So the doctrine of discovery is the Pope's acknowledgement of the Portuguese and the Spanish spheres of influence. So it's basically the Pope's religious decision on how to divide the world. Then the Treaty of Tordesillas is more of the political decision that's made the next year that Spain and Portugal agree to. And if you look, I was watching a lecture today by an author who has a new book out, and he was talking about how Brazil is closer to Africa, and the Pope had given Portugal Africa and parts of Asia as their sphere of influence and included that area of what we know today as Brazil. And so the Pope is drawing these lines, and then the nation states themselves, these monarchies, are also drawing lines that are very similar to the Pope's. And the Pope's lines, and that's part of this doctrine of discovery. Like, okay, if you discover this, this is your sphere of influence. If you discover that, this is your sphere of influence. So it's dividing the world into two spheres of influence, because these were the two first exploring nations on a broad scale from Europe. So that's the doctrine of discovery. That's the Pope's seal of approval, the papal bull that says, yes, Spain has the right to this land and Portugal has the right to that land. That is in 1493, and Pope Alexander VI is sort of putting his stamp of approval. So this is showing the incredible power that the Pope had at this time. And then the Treaty of Tordesillas is basically the same thing, dividing the two spheres of influence, but it's more of a political agreement as opposed to one sanctioned by the church. So they're almost identical. They vary a little bit, but they just are dividing the two spheres of influence between Portugal and Spain, who had consolidated power and were able to afford exploration. So the Pope's sort of weighing in on who gets what, dividing up the spoils here. And let's see, there's one more question here. Yes, so for Sir Walter Raleigh, he is essentially involved in two things. More than that, but two for our purposes. The establishment of Roanoke, and then the call to service in the Spanish Armada. So Sir Walter Raleigh, whom Raleigh, North Carolina is named after, Sir Walter Raleigh is sort of the John Smith of Roanoke, or the John Winthrop. So as John Winthrop is to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and as John Smith is to Virginia and the Jamestown colony. Sir Walter Raleigh was to the Roanoke colony. He is a founding father, if you will, of Roanoke, which doesn't end up really materializing or lasting. And they don't, when he returns, they don't know what's really happened there. And he's called back to help support England against the Spanish. Okay, I'm going to move now to period 2, and let me know in the chat if you want to hear more follow-up. I can follow up on anything that didn't seem to be quite clear there. Let me move my screens around here. Okay, so all right. So with period 2, just this arc of 1607 to 1754, the beginnings of the British sphere of influence, the permanent sphere of influence, to the end of salutary neglect. That's what period 2 is. It's all about Britain and a few other countries, but it's the focus is on Britain and Britain's interaction with Americans. And ultimately, in period 3, British Americans becoming uniquely American and breaking from Britain. But that's period 3. So period 2 is 1607, Jamestown, to 1754, the beginning of the French and Indian War, and the beginning of the end of salutary neglect, which had gone on all this time during the 1600s. So we have initially in the 1500s, but also through 1688, which is a date you need to know, 1688, the Glorious Revolution. English Reformation started by Henry VIII. The importance of this is that it is a political decision that is done. Henry VIII wants an heir to the throne, and he's going to break with the Catholic Church so he can get that heir to the throne. This is a political decision to break with the Catholic Church because of power issues. Henry VIII wants to get a divorce so he can get that male heir. He doesn't end up getting the male heir. It ends up being his daughter, Elizabeth, who is the heir to the throne. But he's trying to get a male heir, and so he'll marry 6 times, trying to seek this heir to the throne. So the English Reformation, it's different from the Protestant Reformation Martin Luther starts. It's another Protestant Reformation, but Martin Luther was really taking issue with the religious practices that he felt were not Christian, like indulgences, buy your way into heaven. He took issue with the religion. Henry VIII is taking issue with, I need an heir, and maybe a little bit with the religion because the Catholic Church doesn't let him divorce, but really he's focused on power. And Martin Luther was really more about cleaning up maybe what he saw as corruption, I would say, within the Catholic Church. So this British sphere of influence and interface with Americans is what period 2 is all about. And so there are 2 primary focuses: the Chesapeake region, where Jamestown is, and Virginia and the House of Burgesses eventually, and the New England, Massachusetts region, which has 2 colonies there. The famous Pilgrims at Plymouth, the separatist Puritans known as Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1620. So they're the first settlers in New England. And then the second larger colony that comes along in New England, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that's in 1630. So you have 1607 Jamestown, 1620 for Plymouth and the Pilgrims and Plymouth Rock and all of the initial sailing of the Mayflower, all of that is 1620. And then 10 years later comes John Winthrop and a group of Puritans looking for this shining city on a hill, which they create in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a Puritan colony. So a Puritan colony that is not a separatist Puritan colony. So it's important to understand that the earliest colony in New England, the Pilgrims, are separatists. They come in 1620, and then 10 years later comes another wave of Puritans that are not quite as strict, but still plenty strict and not very tolerant. They want it for themselves, but not for anyone else. Okay. Um, the idea of the Virginia Company is it's a joint stock company. So we're seeing capitalism even before 1619 with the joint stock company um, and the creation of a joint stock colony. People are chipping in to fund this exploration and hoping to make some profits off this. This is all about investing in stock in this exploration business and seeing if they can make a profit, because they saw what Spain did, which was they brought a ton of gold back. And then here the British arrived and they got nothing, no gold. And I will make a comment on this. I believe I brought this up before, but this is really significant. In the short term, Spain is enriched by their colonies because of all this easy gold that is found. But in the long term, the British benefit because they are forced to create systems, democratic systems, systems of consent, and so that they can survive. And that actually ends up enriching them more in the long term, even though they didn't have that initial burst of gold, which the Spanish really benefited from for about, I would say, about 400 years before they really begin to decline. So the gold was wonderful, and that sounds like long term, but ultimately Spain falls into decline because they have a very strict hierarchy and a gap between their monarchy and their the peasants that they still have even until like 1910. You can see this in Mexico with the Mexican Revolution. In 1910, there's just this huge gap between the rich and the poor, whereas in the what would become the United States through the British tradition of constitution and democratic principles, this is going to create a much leveler playing field. And even from the get-go in New England, in Massachusetts Bay, you see a strong middle class intact coming over with families to set up the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so you don't see this huge gap between the rich and the poor in New England like you do in Mexico following the conquista of Spain's, the conquistadors' arrival and sort of conquering this area and extracting a lot of wealth immediately from the area. So good for them in the short term, but also built an extractive situation that was not sustainable for Spain. And so they contracted, whereas the British equal access to more democratic processes enriched what would become the United States of America. So, okay. So much here. It is important to know that right within like 3 or 4 years of each other, you have the city of Santa Fe established, the city of Quebec established by the French, Santa Fe by the Spanish, Jamestown by the British, and New York by the Dutch. So you've got 4 countries, really the French, the Dutch, the British, and the Spanish, within about 4 years of each other, establishing sophisticated communities that are still around today. Okay, so New York is still around, Santa Fe is still the longest continuously operating capital city and seat of government, you could say, in what is today the United States. So Santa Fe, Quebec, which is not in the United States, but North America still, New York, and well, then you've got a bunch to choose from, but Boston, and then Jamestown and Williamsburg. So those establishments are all Jamestown 1607, Quebec 1608. I don't know if I have all of them on here, but Santa Fe 1610, and whatever, so I have something else in 1609. And then New York City is coming along a little bit later, but New Amsterdam. So, but these are really important to understand that they're taking footholds in what would be the United States, with the exception of Quebec, in this time period, and they're continuously operating. So Santa Fe is established, I think, in 1610. I think, I thought I had it on here. Okay. Um, so also that year 1619, it's important: capitalism, tobacco, House of Burgesses, that idea of representation, democratic republic, um, or representative democracy, and the makings of the republic, and then the slave trade. So you've got capitalism, slavery, and democratic principles, republican principles in 1619. They're with us very early on, and capitalism even earlier with the establishment of Jamestown. But by 1619, all three of those are really established, and that's part of our identity, and the very much still with us, issues that were established in that time. So um, the Wampanoag are the indigenous Americans living where the Mayflower arrivals hit land, and they are doing the same thing that the Powhatan are doing in Jamestown. They're assisting, they're helping, they're translating, they're negotiating, and probably also they regret that later on. So if you ever get up to Plymouth, and it's they have reestablished the Plymouth community, and they have indigenous Americans and European Americans living and working there, and doing the daily tasks that they would have been doing in the 1600s. You can talk to people there who can still talk about what happened to their families, because of the pressure on the land, and what the indigenous um, Wampanoag are going to suffer greatly ultimately from the expansion of the European footprint in what becomes the United States. Um, I'll take a moment here to just talk about James the First, Charles James. So they're all relatives, they're all stewards, and they're all part of the kind of the turmoil of the 1600s. England's doing pretty well, they're still a strong country, but they're riddled with conflict. Like we were during our Civil War, we were still a good country, we came through it, but it was a distraction. And so the English Civil War is similarly a distraction. And again, these are over issues of politics and religion. So when you see in 1620 Puritans coming over, and in 1630 more Puritans coming over, that's part of a great migration of groups of people who were being persecuted under the rule of the Stuarts, and they're fleeing the Stuarts, and they're establishing these colonies: Shining City on a Hill, Pilgrims establishing Plymouth, and they're seeking refuge from intolerance back home. And the Stuarts are not brimming with tolerance, and so um, they've just come through the English Reformation, so they're no longer Catholic, but they lean toward Catholicism. The Scottish still maintain some Catholic leanings, and the Stuarts are both Scottish and British. So there's a lot of turmoil in this time period, with the English Civil War happening halfway through the 1600s, and Oliver Cromwell taking over, and sort of becoming this dictator over Parliament and canceling out the monarchy for about 12 years. So I think a lot of this we touched on with some of your DBQ, but John Winthrop is famous for his sermon, Model of Christian Charity, and talking about City on a Hill. And yet there is the problem of intolerance, and many of you wrote about this in your essays. Roger Williams, Anne Hutchinson, they're persecuted, they're banished, they're not accepted, even though their religion was right on. Their questioning authority was not okay. You have that consolidation of power in New England. You have your governor is your judge, is your minister. A lot of power that these leaders had because of the theocracy that was the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Um, the covenant of grace and the covenant of works, these are just differences within Christianity that denominations still have today. Some believe that works can get you to heaven, and some believe that grace gets you to heaven. And some believe kind of even a combination of both. But Puritans definitely were against the notion that if you were did good deeds, that you would get to heaven. That was that conflicted with their theology that predestined, and this was all graced and predestined before you were born. You were part of the elect, and you had nothing to do with it, really. And so that's what gets Anne Hutchinson into some trouble as well, because she sees ministers judging others and speculating that they are not going to heaven, and she accuses them of supporting the covenant of works, because how would they know based on what someone does if they're going to heaven or not, if they've been graced or not? So, but she's going to be removed from the colony for questioning authority, as was Roger Williams. And his two things were, he felt like separation of church and state and paying Native Americans should be two things that should be part of the shining city on a hill. And that was not a welcome prospect for those who were in charge. So so you see Connecticut, Rhode Island, Maryland, Pennsylvania, these colonies are going to be established, and they're going to have they're going to begin separating church and state. They're going to be more tolerant to different religions. You don't have to be one certain religion to be able to vote. And so you'll see them beginning to exercise some principles of toleration that the Massachusetts Bay Colony does not have until about 1691. So it's much later for them. The Navigation Acts, definitely want to know about that. This is the evidence that salutary neglect is happening, because you have these laws, Navigation Acts, British ships, British crews, British ports, and they're over 100 years worth of navigation laws that are on the books, but they're not necessarily enforced. And the British colonists are kind of getting around this whole, well, we have to trade with just British ports, just British crews. No, they're going to start trading with Spanish crews and French ports and French colonies. They're not going to want to go all the way back to France. I mean, to Britain, to France, to Britain, to back. They're going to go, why don't we just go right here and trade directly, which was a no-no, but they did it anyway. And this is evidence of salutary neglect, because a lot of these navigation acts simply weren't enforced. Rebellions, you are going to see uprisings amongst many Americans. American slaves are going to rise up in South Carolina in the Stono Rebellion. American Indians are going to rise up in King Philip's War. And in 1622, the Powhatan Confederacy will rise up against Europeans. But the only, and I don't think I've talked about this, so this is definitely worth writing down. The only successful let me see if it's on here. I don't see it on there. I seem to have left off both. The only successful indigenous uprising is in 1680. Just double checking to see if it's on here. I don't see it. Is in 1680, and this is it's like spelled like the word Pope, Pope, Pope's Rebellion. This is taking place in Santa Fe and Taos, New Mexico. So it's still part of New Spain. the Taos Pueblo rises up against um, a, some pretty violent Spanish leadership in New Mexico, which is New Spain, and they push back against the Spanish leaders, and they successfully overthrow Spain's rule in New Mexico for 12 years. They push the Spanish out of New Mexico for 12 years. This is called Pope's Rebellion, and it is the only successful uprising against European Americans, whether it's a slave uprising or an Indigenous American uprising. The only successful one is Pope's Rebellion, because they rise up and they maintain power for 12 years. It's not permanent success, but it is significant success. So I'm surprised I don't know what I did if I took that off. Okay. I feel like y'all know a lot of this stuff, but it is 1688 where you see the divine right of kings disappear, the rise of Mary and William, or William and Mary, as they are also called. Mary and William of Orange, Mary of England, this is James II's daughter, will take power after James is run out of town with his very unpopular rule over not just England, but also the colonies. His dominion of New England was hugely unpopular. His choice of his Catholic daughter to become the next ruler was hugely unpopular. So he's not going to rule for very long, and he is going to be run out during the Glorious Revolution, where his daughter Mary, who was being raised as a Protestant and not a Catholic, will ascend to the throne, but Parliament will have a lot more power as Britain becomes a constitutional monarchy in 1688. And this will give a lot more representative values to the rule of this empire and less power for the monarch. So this is a significant change happening, probably because a lot of things that John Locke was saying at the time about this is ridiculous, that divine right doesn't exist, and we need to have a social contract, and there needs to be more, consent, and Parliament should have a bigger role, because a monarch is just an accident of birth. And they may be a great monarch or they may be a horrible monarch, but it's literally an accident of birth that you've got this person in power, not based on any sort of merit. So John Locke's really taking issue with a failure to look at the social contract and have some representation and some consent. By the middle of the 1600s, really this issue of God comes into play. Capitalism seems to be supplanting religion, or at least religious attendance at church. So this is when you have the response of the halfway covenant, and you start to see the outreach to maintain church attendance in 1662. And then all of this turmoil is going to lead to the Salem witch trials in 1692. Ultimately, in response to the Enlightenment, the Great Awakening, which is a religious revival of Christianity. So I'm going to talk about admiralty courts for just a second, because I really haven't talked about that. Admiralty courts are something that the colonists do not like. They don't want a military tribunal. They want courts in which Americans who live in the Americas are making up those courts, as opposed to a military tribunal that is going to be a British tribunal. So Americans still consider themselves British, but they don't want a military tribunal done by people who don't know them. They want local courts deciding what happens in legal disputes. Okay, I'm going to move to the end of period 2. I'm going to look and see if there's anything in the chat here. If there's something that you want me to touch on, I'm happy to look at that. At the end of this document, we're getting into the French and Indian War and some of Ben Franklin's Enlightenment influenced ideas. But one of them is this idea of strength in numbers, join or die, unity against a common foe. United we stand against a common foe. And this is evidenced in the Albany Plan of Union. Several of you wrote about that. As a connection, I think, from one time period to another, but not really within the time period of 1630 to 1660. Looking in the, okay, I don't see anything here, so I'm going to go ahead and move to period 3 and spend 6 minutes on period 3. Okay. Well, luckily, this is the one we've been focused on the most recently. I'm going to talk about a couple people on here that I haven't talked about, I don't think. One of the people on here is about 15 people down, maybe 10 to 15 people down on the left-hand column. And this is James Otis. James Otis was an attorney, and he was tasked with supporting writs of assistance. Writs of assistance were search warrants, and the search warrants were basically pretty arbitrary. So you could be sitting at your home in one of the American colonies and suddenly be thrown open to a search with a very general warrant that was not, it was a very broad warrant. And Americans did not like this arbitrary use of power against them. And so James Otis was to be the enforcer. He's an attorney, and he gets involved in this, and he realizes that this is wrong. He's actually, like, his job is to enforce these arbitrary search warrants that are called writs of assistance. And he says that this is wrong. He quits his job and volunteers to support the opposition to writs of assistance, what they call illegal searches and seizures. So this is going to become foundational in the Declaration of Independence and later in the Constitution, principles that Americans find very precious, that their privacy, their property is their castle, that there has to be probable cause to search someone's home or to conduct some sort of search. So you see some of the foundations here for our Constitution. I'm going to really shift gears here and talk about something that I know I haven't talked about, and then I'll look at anything in the chat and answer those things. But there is something I do not think I talked about, and I was doing a little research today, and I realized I didn't think I had talked about it. And this is from 1787. It's the Northwest Ordinance. I'll talk about this more when I talk about slavery in period 5, but this is a really important idea. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is happening at the same time that we're building our Constitution. We're responding to Shays' Rebellion. All this craziness is going on, but we're also expanding far beyond 1763, far beyond the Appalachian Mountains, the King's Proclamation of 1763, when we weren't supposed to cross over those mountains because it was causing us to get into wars on the frontier that were expensive. Well, we crossed the mountains and we started to fill up Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, then Michigan, then Wisconsin, and then Minnesota. It's kind of called the Great Lakes region because those states all touch one of the Great Lakes. So when it's time for when all this expansion is happening, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is going to admit those new states into the Union. And it's also going to set up the process by which you admit states into the Union. And one of the criteria is that you have to have 60,000 people living in a territory before it can qualify to become a state. That number is going to be really important leading up to the Civil War. 60,000 people living in a territory in order to apply for statehood. That's going to come out of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Another really important thing that I'll just touch on for a moment here that comes out of the Ordinance of 1787 is that no slavery is allowed in any of the Northwest territories in their process of becoming states. So becoming territories and then becoming states, slavery is not allowed in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, or Minnesota. The importance of this is that slavery is being disdained and is considered abhorrent, is a stain, is considered evil by many in this time period. And it is part of a contentious fight in the Constitutional Convention this same year, this year of the Northwest Ordinance, Shays Rebellion, and the Constitutional Convention. It is explicitly referenced in the Northwest Ordinance, no slavery allowed. It is battled in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And the compromise that comes out of that, two of the compromises, this is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll answer any questions that you have. The two compromises that come out of this battle for our Constitution, one benefits the North. This is the Connecticut Compromise. It gives the North a lot of electoral votes because of population and numbers of states that are anti-slavery. The other side of the compromise is the second compromise that gives power to the South is the 3/5 compromise. And this is contentious in its time, but it was either unite and compromise or divide. And so they chose unity over division, and they went with the 3/5 compromise. But again, it was odious. Even Jefferson considered it evil, and he was a slave owner. So in the contemporary conversation, there were people adamant that slavery should not be allowed in this new country, this new constitution that was being designed. But it is the result of compromise. And so that is some of the backstory there. Okay, if you have any questions, I see we're at 8 o'clock. I'm not going to take your time. Please take a look at those Quizlets. If you're having a hard time to get into the Quizlet, just click on the title of the Quizlet. If it gives you a frown face, just click on the title of the Quizlet or the little box in the corner, and it'll open those Quizlets. I can't figure out why they don't integrate well into Schoology, but it's just the link, I guess. I don't know why it's a problem, but so you should be able to study those. Please study those Quizlets. They will help you. They're your friend. Take a look at your notes, and I will see half of you tomorrow, and I will see half of you Wednesday. So this concludes our review session. I'm going to stop recording, and I will upload this to Schoology tonight. So let me stop.